So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Jonathan Armstrong, who's a musician, composer, and educator serving as the Director of Jazz Studies and Commercial Music at Idaho State University. He moved to Pocatello in 2015 after living and working as a professional musician in Los Angeles for 9 years. Jonathan has established a creative and dynamic career as a band leader, performer, contemporary composer, and innovative educator. And so I am really looking forward to this. 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. Good to see you all here. I'm going to talk about the future of the music industry as I see it, and relating it to the ancient past. So to start off, to just talk about like what the music industry is. About 5 years ago, actually that's not right, 8 years ago, I've been here for a couple of years, and we had some money put together to buy recording equipment for the music department. So I bought a bunch of recording equipment, and we turned what was a listening lab into a recording studio. And it took about a year to do, and it's still functional. It's a great recording studio, real wonderful state-of-the-art equipment, and I was very proud of it. And I'd run into an alumni, someone who I had known that had graduated far before me. He's about my age. I ran into him in a music store, and he had heard about the recording studio, and so he was asking me about it. He's like, "Yeah, we got this recording studio, and I'm thinking about building a major centered around like the recording arts and what ended up being commercial music." And he just said this one sentence, and I actually really liked it, but the sentence stuck with me. He said, "That's funny that colleges always implement technology after they've gone obsolete." And then he walks away. And there was a little bit of like, hey, but then also, I just kept chewing on it for years. It's like, it's a heck of a point. Because the time, and even more so now, the music industry has been just absolutely dismantled from what it was. So let's start by talking about the music industry. So this is a 2017 graph, so it's not up to date. But you can only imagine where the trends are going from here. As you can see, this kind of like turquoise color is physical sales of albums, which once reached upwards of 25 billion and now are much, much less. And you can see this streaming, and which is the darker kind of green, growing and growing. You can imagine how that just continues to eat more and more what's going on in the music industry, and even digital downloads, whereas they peaked right around here, they've actually been going down. So more of this, sad facts. If you look at the entire recorded music industry, again, 2023, this is the latest data that the RAIAA, recording industry, I actually forgot the Association of America, thank you very much, Steve. Physical only accounts for about 11% of sales, and streaming is 84%. And even if you look at what's going on here with permanent downloads, like that's only this very small amount. 3% of the industry is even people buying music the way that many of us are used to. It wasn't that long ago you would go buy an album. Well, physical is certainly more than digital downloads, but this entire pie of this slice of physical plus digital downloads, essentially buying an album at track, what it always used to be, that's only 14% of the industry. And if you look at what the streaming actually is, it's almost entirely paid subscriptions, is where the money is actually going to. So what we've done, and then physical, you know, we're looking at 1.7 billion. There's still a lot of money going in physical. And what's interesting is vinyl is totally outpacing CDs, and that's continuing today, which is a whole other conversation we can get into later. In fact, there was some study, I actually forgot the percentage, but there's a significant percentage of people that buy vinyl don't own a record player. Yeah. Roughly half, right?
I don't own a record player, and I have vinyl. And
so why do you?
Okay, so well, some of them I stole from my parents because they weren't using them.
Cool.
And that's what kids do. And one of them was actually the Beatles' Abbey Road. And yeah, like the original Abbey Road, which I've actually framed, and I framed the iconic picture out. And so it kind of started that way, like, and my stepfather gave me most of his record collection. So it kind of just started. Like I was able to get them for free, and now I kind of buy them every now and then. I don't buy a whole lot, but it's things I generally like. I don't buy a lot of CDs either. The last CD I bought was Alison Krauss's new CD that came out this spring. So if I buy something, I really like it. That's why. And in terms of not having a record player, I don't have room for one in my apartment. It's something I would like to buy at some point and actually listen to them on vinyl, or listen to the vinyl, because I do remember listening to vinyl growing up. And so yeah, it's a weird dichotomy.
And so, yeah, best estimates on why that's happening, and the youth are buying them too, like people 20 and younger are buying vinyl. And the best guesses is very similar, like they just like holding a 12 by 12 object. And there's surveys that show that the youth understand how predatory the streaming industry is, and they realize that if they buy, even if it's a Taylor Swift album or a Chef L. Ron or even more indie records, that money is, for the most part, going to the artist, which is not the case with Ustream, right? You've all heard this concept of one stream equals one fraction of a penny for an artist. So Lady Gaga came out a couple of years ago, and she had something that was streamed over 10 million times, and she earned several $1,000s, which is just not an industry that you can actually support artists. So the whole thing is in rough shape, right? Like the recording industry is in a very terrible place. And this is how the money is being spent. It's being spent on platforms, right? It's being spent on streaming platforms, not necessarily to the artists themselves. Now, Spotify will tell you, well, we actually give a lot of this money to the record labels, and it's up to them to get it to the artists. But the entire business model is essentially you get all the music that's ever been recorded forever for $12 a month. And like no consumer is ever going to say no to that. But there's no way, you'd have to believe in Santa Claus to imagine that that business model would result in actually having money go to the musicians the way that it used to. Right? So to go back to my friend who was like talking about the obsolescence of the recording industry, I made this graph just as a goof. So the history of music goes back to roughly 40,000 BCE. And the recording industry, of which there's been one, happened one time in history, and now it's going away. This is not scientific, I just made this kind of as a line. But it's like the music industry is not the recorded music industry. The music industry's been around for a very, 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 very long time. Now, the industry might have been you were paid in goats, or you just had a really good situation in your particular society, but musicians have been cared for and honored members of societies for tens and tens and tens of thousands of years. And the recording and music industry has only been around for very small. So the other thing that's kind of hacking at musicians is the touring industry. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but this really wonderful UK-based, what are they? Pirate Studios is a really interesting, they're kind of like a musicians' rights advocacy group. They just post a lot of surveys, and they surveyed over 1,700 musicians talking about touring. And in the last 10 years, it's been very difficult to break even touring. And part of that is venues are being consolidated into smaller and smaller investment groups, less and less investment groups, I should say. So what used to be like a funky club in downtown Portland is now owned by some investment company, venture capitalists and stuff like that. And they figured out that a lot of musicians are making money on their merchandise. So now almost every venue takes merch cuts, upwards of 30% of the t-shirts and CDs and whatever the band sells, as just more ways. And you have all these artists trying to make it big, and so you have this race to the bottom of touring acts. And then what happened, and I saw this even in LA in the 9 years that I was there, that the music industry itself becomes gentrified. Just to say it very plainly, you start to notice a trend of all the musicians that are hiring people for gigs, and they tend to have, as one of my friends put it, parents with links in Wikipedia. They come from money, they have money, they're connected to the industry, and it becomes kind of like a rich kid playground. Because there's just not that farm system that there used to be. You had these independent venues that you could actually work your way through and actually make it big. There's just not the same thing going on, right? So that's just the reality. And, but I guess part of my lecture here today is to say that's okay. Like the recorded music industry being this 100-year blip, right? You start selling phonographs in the 1930s or so, it's 2025, we're about to lose it, right? Or we maybe have already lost it. That's okay, it's a 100-year blip. Again, please see this scientific graph. Mark Fisher is a really interesting philosopher and futurist and someone that writes a lot about culture. And he has this phrase that he uses called slow cancellation of the future. And he actually coined this phrase 12 years ago. I think it was in 2012. He wrote a book called The Ghosts of My Past. And it's a fascinating concept. I won't spend too much time on it because I don't fully agree with him. But his concept is recorded media became prevalent and widespread very quickly, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And if you listen to a hit song in the mid-60s and a hit song in the mid-80s, they're radically different, absolutely hugely different with the technology. But then if you listen to a hit song in the 80s and a hit song in the mid-2000s, it's less of a difference. And then if you listen to a hit song in 2005 and then a hit song in 2025, we're talking about this kind of like more of a, what he calls is this sort of like this coalescence of genre, of culture, where everyone's kind of referencing the same things. You can almost imagine that in the 1960s and 70s, I mean, I'll even say this, if someone said, what kind of music are you into in the 1940s, let alone the 1840s and 1740s and 1640s and the 7040s BCE, your answer wouldn't be like trance house from Jamaica. You know what I mean? You'd be like, that bar down the street has a fiddle player that I like. You know, what music are you into? I don't know, what we sing in church. What are you even talking about? Like the question wouldn't make any sense until roughly 1950 something, when everyone had the commerce, like there was this industry that popped out of absolute nowhere. I'm arguing a bubble that is feeding off this very deep well of culture that happened for tens of thousands of years all over the world. And now it's this little bubble where now you could commodify a real cultural movement. Go back to Jamaica, you could commodify a real cultural movement. In LA, I had the honor of playing with Rastafarians. I played reggae music, I played rhythm guitar with this reggae band called Brown Rice. And there was an historical Rastafarian house in South Central where a lot of these musicians lived. And I got to know them and meet them. They were really wonderful people. A lot of them were from Jamaica, or they still practice Rastafarian. Really interesting group of people. Well, when they talk about reggae music, they talk about it in a spiritual sense. They talk about it as a very important part of who they are as human beings, not just like a thing that a frat house can play on a Saturday afternoon. Do you know what I mean? So and that's true for every culture, every genre. We talk about genres as if they're of themselves, as if they're true, but they're not. They're just this tiny little watered down version of something that might have taken decades, if not centuries, to cultivate that was specific to the region. When you meet people, I've never been to Jamaica, when you meet people that play reggae music, they talk about the music in the same way they talk about the climate and the food and the people and the women and the men and the beach and all that kind of stuff. That's all part of it. When you listen to bossa nova music, you have to understand what it's like in Sao Paulo, Brazil. When you listen to electronic and dance music, there's this really wonderful book on Jay Dilla. Does anyone know who Jay Dilla is? He's a really important hip hop producer in the 90s and 2000s. Probably one of our country's greatest musical geniuses of the last 50 years. Unbelievable, and I won't do a whole Jay Dilla lecture, although call me next year. And all the music you hear on the radio is derivative of Jay Dilla. He was just a singular figure, grew up in Detroit. This book, a biography on him, has an entire chapter on how Detroit is laid out, the municipality, and how it's cut into these different triangles, and why that is the reason why Detroit became the center of the technological music world, with Motown first, which Motown is certainly full of really talented players, but the real trick of Motown is it was the most technologically advanced music studio in the world for about 20 years. No one had their equipment, no one had their engineers, and also that's where our cars come from. There's a technological genius to Detroit that resulted in genius with manufacturing and also genius with music. And when I use that term, and I'll come back to this concept, I'm very inspired. There's a book, I'm blanking on the name of it, but it actually goes into the history of the word genius, which in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, when that word kind of first came about, it was used in terms of areas rather than people. So this town had a genius for fishing because it was on the lake, and there was a certain thing about how, or I mean on the peninsula, there was a certain way that the currents brought fish in. And so not only did they have a resource advantage to fishing, but then generations of artisans that made the nets and did the hooks, and all of a sudden you go to that village when you want to know about fishing. Well, that town had a genius for blacksmithing. This town might have a genius for dyeing because of the flowers that grew there. So it's this mix of the resources and the culture and the community and the infrastructure of the area, and then you have generations of people that learn from it. So Jay Dilla, a brilliant hip hop producer in the 90s, came about learning from the brilliant engineers of Motown. Do you know what I'm saying? Like they were his forefathers. So not only was the knowledge passed down, but there's something specific, I won't go into it, about the way Detroit was laid out and the way the buses had to go through that made it a town specific for that kind of intelligence. So this slow cancellation in the future essentially dulls that. It takes this idea of regionality, of uniqueness, of local pride, of like what's here in your community that you grew up in, you tended not to move, we all kind of stuck where we were. And it took all that and it just sort of flattened everything. And the brilliant part of it, the brilliant part of any bubble, is you have this absolute explosion of information. So we could hear reggae music, we could hear Western African Afrobeat music. I can listen to choirs from small villages in Slavic countries that will make the hair stand up on the end. You know what I mean? Like, it's unbelievable the kind of music. Alison Krauss, you can buy an Alison Krauss. I love Alison Krauss. I remember when I watched Oh Brother, We're Out There for the first time, and it just exploded in my head. Like, what is going on here? I want to know everything about it.
Yeah, I've seen her 4 times in concert.
She's
amazing.
unbelievable, right?
Yeah.
Appalachian musician. But she comes from this genius of Appalachian music, which that's a whole other long story. But there's that. And now people are learning from the CD of Alison Krauss. So if I want to be an Appalachian type folk singer, I'm going to listen to an Alison Krauss CD. That's not the same thing as your uncle playing fiddle tunes for you. It's not the same thing of like, we all get together for a fish boil on Fridays. That's not the same thing as we all go to church together. My pastor handles snakes, not to be weird, but that's all part of it, right? Like poisonous snakes. So if you don't have poisonous snakes in your religion, like you're not going to sing like Alison Krauss. It's just like not the same thing. So we're all learning from these artifacts. We're all learning from these watered down versions of what is just musical expression and culture. And that's Mark Fisher's essential point, is that we're losing this. We kind of have this like downward spiral of culture because there's not enough investment in our local communities, there's not enough pride in what music we're making. Cool? So let's dig in a little bit. What's the end result of derivative music? Generative AI. However, the more you dig into generative AI, no one wants it. It just doesn't seem like anyone really wants generative AI aside from just like a goof. Like, in my experience, this is anecdotal, I admit, the only generative AI I see is just like a joke. Let me like make a Independence Day movie, but it's Joe Biden instead of, you know, whoever the guy was that played the president. You know, it's stuff like that. Am I wrong? Like, that's what we're seeing. It's just slop. It's nonsense. No one is actually buying generative AI music or generative AI art. It's being done to us. And now it's like with deepfakes, we don't even know what's going on. Nobody likes it. The youth don't like it. 72% of voters from this AIPI survey want AI to slow down. 70% agree mitigating the risk should be a global priority. Like, people are not into this. And there's an argument for like every new technology kind of goes through something like this, but they weren't saying this about phones. You know, it's like this is new in a different way. There's a recent court ruling that says that human beings are an essential part of valid copyright claim. And then recently Spotify had been, this is a whole other conversation, they had actually been teasing AI artists and putting them in this playlist. There's a really wonderful author that I'll talk about later named Ted Gioia, who's been actually investigating it. And then there was this big Velvet Sundown controversy. You guys heard of this? It's a fake band that made it onto Spotify, and it got millions and millions of downloads. And it just looks like a bunch of just like scraggly haired dudes that are just like singing kind of rock music. And it sounds like any other kind of derivative music. It sounded fine, it sounded normal. I probably wouldn't have passed the Turing test, so to speak. But it generated more backlash than Spotify was ready for. So even though they have been slowly slipping in these AI fake artists into playlists for years, this shocked them, and then they ended up taking 75 million AI generated songs down. What's the scene in Casablanca? They're like, I'm shocked that there's gambling in this. You know, that was the energy. It's like they were trying to brag about it. It's like, wait, that actually tells on yourself that you had 75 million AI songs that you were just like, what? That was there the whole time? Like, come on. Like, so they were trying, because all these record labels and artists and everything, this has been a story for decades. They've been trying to subvert the artists or trying to replace the art. They're like, if they could just not have to deal with the drunks of Oasis, and just, you know, like they would just make my life so much easier. That's been going on for a really long time. Artists are unpredictable. They're very wild people. They party. Sometimes they have mental health issues. And so this idea of Spotify and all these companies have actually been like testing the waters of like, well, we could just create our own music. We don't even have to pay. This is perfect. It's full circle. And then they got caught, essentially. This part's interesting, and I'll do this quickly. The MIT Media Lab just did a study that says 95% of organizations have not seen the measurable return on their investments. So this goes into this idea of work slump, which is becoming a bigger thing. So this comes from the Harvard Business Review. And just this little graph caught my eye. I was just doing some reading in preparation for the lecture that essentially, like, when someone says work slump, it's totally, and this study goes into like how many millions of dollars it's costing businesses in productivity, because now part of whatever industry you're in is trying to determine what's slop and what's not. And if someone sends them something that was clearly edited by AI, or there's just a couple scenes in there, they're actually losing respect for their coworkers. As you can see here, they see them as less creative, less capable, less intelligent, less trustworthy when they're using AI generatively. Not for search terms, that's a whole different conversation, not to like help you build code or something, but actually just like straight up slop. So what I'm arguing is like this idea of AI is almost, in terms of a creative perspective, is like one of the greatest gifts that we can use, meaning it's teaching us about our own habits. We got addicted to this globalization of music. I can buy albums from all over the world. And then we got addicted to like genre, and we talk about these genres and stuff, but we're not really studying the culture. We're not going, right? That's okay, that's all part of globalization. But what we lost in the meantime is with everyone just listening and being inspired by the same CDs, and then like your inspiration is what's your, I'm even saying CDs, that's AG right there. Your particular playlist, your particular group of music, recorded music that you listen to. And we just become the products of like the stuff that we own, and less so the participants in a regional human culture, which is what music had been for, again, tens and tens and tens of thousands of years. So this recent blip, just like many other blips, just like went wild, spun out of control, and now we end up with generative AI. And I even teach this, I talk about this with my students. This concept that's about 20, 30 years old of like, if you're gonna record music, this goes back to this guy that talked to me in the music store. If you're gonna just record music and have it sound, often the term is radio ready, so it's like good enough for the radio, you're essentially competing with 75 million AI slops that are also learning. You know, this is to go into this a little bit, many of you probably all already know this, but the reason why AI slop music can exist is because they're just gobbling up countless songs, analyzing them, and then recreating them. So the more recordings that are out there of a particular genre, the closer AI can get. So AI is by definition derivative. And so then if we teach at a university how to be derivative as well, then it's like there's no point, right? We're just all kind of competing in the same waters. But I'm arguing that's been happening for decades. AI is just showing us that about as clearly as possible. So let's talk about ancient music. This really great, this author I talked about earlier, Ted Gioia. He has a great Substack. I really like him. I think he's an excellent author. He has this great book called Music: A Subversive History, which is a very wonderful book. It's an interesting thing. I'm just going to share a couple things from the book, and then we'll get into some ancient musicians. He tells a story of Angus Wilson, who was a tribal leader in the Nez Perce Native American tribe in Oregon. And there was an anthropologist named Krauss, just blanked him, Bernie Krauss, was studying the music. And he couldn't get his head around it. He couldn't understand Nez Perce music. It was just like so different than anything he'd ever experienced. And finally, this guy, Angus Wilson's like, I'll show you how we do our music. So he invites Krauss to sit by him on a riverbank. And the two of them sit there and they just sit still. And Bernie's like, what's going on? He's like, just Angus, hold on. And they sit there for a very long time. And then at some point, the wind picks up and it blows across the riverbank and through this little collection of reeds that are right by the riverbank. And when it hits the reeds just so, Bernie Krauss talks about how it's as if a pipe organ came out of nowhere. And he heard this pipe organ chord just like appear. And then Angus Wilson takes one of those reeds, pokes a couple holes in it with his knife, and improvises with that. And he goes, that's how we learned our music. So this story is found everywhere. Anthropologists talk about this all the time. When I was in undergrad, I went to undergrad at the University of Washington. I was a jazz major on the jazz saxophonist. But I became good friends with a lot of the anthropologists. It's a very significant anthropology program at the University of Washington. So I had about a dozen very good friends. I would go to their apartments and I would listen to just wild music from all over the world, field recordings of a Pakistani tribe playing 3 nays that are slightly out of tune with each other with like 10 drums during a goat sacrifice. Like stuff like that, like they would play me this stuff on tapes. It was just like my favorite way to spend a Friday night. I just love these guys so much. And when I read that chapter, I remember them talking about stuff like this. They talk about Aboriginal tribes that played music improvising with the trees, because when the rain hits certain trees, it sounds different from these trees. And that music changes during the seasons because the seasons change the way the leaves do. About ancient Turkish tribes that would play in specific areas of caves that would resonate in certain ways, and then you could actually trace the tuning system to how the resonance of the cave. I mean, this is just a story we find everywhere. And what Ted Gioia writes about it, and this is a little quote about humans evolved in an ecosystem that already contained formidable sound. And he says music theory wasn't invented, it was discovered. The entire basis of our tuning system is all based on the inherent overtone system of any one pitch. I won't go into that a lot. When you have one pitch, you have all these overtones, these sympathetic vibrations that go up, and if you go up far enough, you get a major chord. Like all of Western music history, all of music history across the world has a grandfather, a grandmother in terms of it, and it's the physics of sound itself. It's the natural ecosystem. There's countless stories of there's countless music that emulates animals. Ancient music was very animalistic. Ursula K. Le Guin has this quote that I really like. We humans have made reduced ourselves in a world. Oh, reduced to ourselves in our artifacts. I apologize. I did that wrong. We humans have made a world reduced to ourselves in our artifacts, but we weren't made for it. And we have to teach our children to live in this poverty and exile. This was just during an interview, she just threw that out there. Any Ursula K. Le Guin fans? Oh, I love her writing. She's a science fiction writer. Can't recommend her enough. And she writes like this all the time. The fact that she just dropped this in an interview just blew my mind. But I think that's really wonderful. And then in this book, Ted Gioia goes into countless ancient musical tribes that did have music that emulated bird calls, that emulated rhinoceroses, that emulated elephants. That's part of the music. In fact, the whole concept of ancient music is quite violent, right? There's this story he tells of a drum-making workshop with the drummer for the Grateful Dead, Mickey Hart. And everyone goes to this like hippie commune in Oregon. They're like, we're gonna make a drum with Mickey Hart. And he goes, step 1, kill a deer. What? Step 2, chop down a tree. And his point was like, every drum started as an act of violence against an animal, or for food, and then the drum was made to honor, right? Every flute, this was made of bones. Like these instruments that we have in the orchestra, he has a chapter called Carnivores of the Orchestra. It's like there's something about every instrument. A horn was literally a horn from some kind of a beast. So we lived among animals. Animals were a huge part of our lives, and what Ursula K. Le Guin talks about in this quote is very relevant. We barely see it. We have pets, that's not the same thing. And so this idea of like animals and nature through sound, through their power, through everything is totally controlling your lives. This idea, he talks about this Prometheus idea of like humans using sound, organized sound. Darwin talks about this as like using sound not only for mating, but as a way to have control over your existence. And the argument is that music is not an art, it is a power, it is a technology that we have employed for a long, long time, well before the concept of art. And that it maybe is misunderstood as an art form. Maybe it's misunderstood as just simply recorded data. And then to talk about this universality of shamanism. Shamanism is just like a folk religion. You go from Siberia to Native Americans to Ireland to India. It doesn't matter where you go. This idea of some person of the tribe, a spiritual leader of the tribe, evoking the power of animals, becoming animals. There's stories about evoking gods and goddesses. This idea of like magic being part of music is just found everywhere. There's just no place you won't find it in any indigenous culture. This idea of like that's what music was. It's this technology to play it in a certain way to get into a trance. Now, my aunt is a really interesting woman, and she studied shamanism. She studied with a certain person that went all over the world and did a bunch of field recordings. And there's this certain tempo that you play a shaman drum that is found very often. And it's essentially 280 beats per minute. You just sort of hit like boom, 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 boom. And it's this idea of transcendental meditation. So this idea of like a shaman plays a drum, they play it in a certain way, and then you start to listen to it at some point, just everything kind of like unspools, and you just sort of go on like a journey. That's very common concept. Well, if you take that and you match it to modern neuroscience and this concept of entrainment, you ever heard of this idea? So we have brain waves that happen in certain bands of frequency. And deep meditation and sleep happens in what's called theta waves, which is 4 to 8 hertz. Our human hearing doesn't start until 50 hertz, maybe 35 if you're a teenager. But we can only hear so low. And then after that, think about what music is. When I make music, when I make a sound, what I'm doing is I'm disrupting the air between you and I with a pulse wave. And then whether I sing a low note is a slower pulse wave, and a higher note is a higher pulse, but a faster pulse wave. That's the frequency. So we often see it like this. It's actually this, right? It's like rarefaction in, what do you call it? I forgot. I'm pushing towards you and pulling apart, pushing towards you and pulling apart. 100 times a second, 1,000 times a second would be a higher note. 20,000 would be past our human hearing. Well, 50 times a second would be a low note. Well, if you go lower and lower and lower, 4 hertz doesn't sound like anything except for just 4 oscillations a second, which would be something like bum, 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 bum. You understand what I'm saying? So like to finish my point, sorry. With entrainment, there's these studies that you can put headphones on a person and an EEG reader to read their brainwave. And you can play them 4 hertz. Well, you can't actually play them 4 hertz. So what you do is you play them 100 hertz and 104 hertz at the same time. And there's what's called a difference tone. So you can actually hear this 4 hertz, 4 oscillations a second in between the 2 notes. And that the EEG reader will show that the person can go into theta state, which is something the shamans have been doing for tens and tens of thousands of years by playing that exact same pulse, that 280 beats per minute. So I'm not here to say anything too crazy, except for it's inarguable that ancient music was a lot weirder than we think. And this book actually goes to a lot of examples of reputable academics, of which we're among, that are trying to hide the weird stuff. So like, I don't know what to do about that. There's all this stuff about Orpheus, about Pythagoras doing some wild stuff like playing music for the dead. They're just like, not that part, let's just deal with the triangles. You know, like this kind of thing has been kind of edited out because rational modern Westerners are like, I don't know what to do about that. And so this book, and then this book, which I'll talk about in a second, just go into like what we actually So let's take it. So this one, The Mystery of Music by Lewis Holmes, it's just 30 biographies of ancient musicians. And I'm just going to rip through a few of them. But he talks about like this common function of music that you find throughout the world, throughout history. And one of the big ones is storytelling and history keeping. A friend of mine, a wonderful jazz drummer, Trevor Andrews, was also, for a time in his life, was a teacher at a local school in downtown Los Angeles. And he studied talking drum. You see the talking drum before? So it's like a drum with two heads, and it has all these ropes on it, and based on how you squeeze it, it goes, you can play all these pitches. And he studied it with a Nigerian talking drum master, so he knew a lot of rhythms and a lot of stuff. Well, he brought it to school one day. He was teaching an elementary school in downtown Los Angeles. And one of the days he brought it, there happened to be a Nigerian substitute teacher who was like, "You play talking drum? That's so cool." My friend's a white guy from Colorado. He was like really genuinely interested. He's like, "Can you play me something?" He's like, "Yeah." He played him some stuff he had learned. And the Nigerian guy's like, "I don't understand." And he plays again. He's like, "I don't quite, like, what tribe is that? Like, what are you doing?" And then they talked for a while to the Nigerian guy. He was trying to actually understand the language of it. And he said, when we grew up, like, a talking drum player, even in modern Nigeria, would go up and be like, "Oh, hi, Doug, son of da-da-da-da, son of your mom, your dad, you come from this place." Like, they would play people's introductions, and it was like a real language.
So it literally talked, you could say. Okay.
That's why it's called a talking drum. But they were also historical keepers of the village. They knew the thing, and they could play the drum. And this idea of storytelling is a very ancient art that was always associated with music. So like fables, epics, we'll talk about with some of these musicians. Like they were always telling some story that brought the community together. This is our story. This is our village. A lot of times, and we'll actually look at two of them, the part of what helped bring Japan together was one of the epics that Akashi no Kakauchi wrote, which I'll talk about in a second. Bringing Mali together came from musicians. Bringing ancient Sumeria together was musical ballads, epics, and all these things. So you could have these songs that would actually bring cultures together. Spiritualities, rituals, and trance. We already kind of talked about that, but that's a really big part of this as well. It's just like going to have some kind of a spiritual transcendent experience was a huge part of the function of music anciently, which is true even today, right? Absolutely. You go to church, there's music. I don't care what church you go to, there's music. Social fun and entrainment, certainly like just like dances, whether it be contra dances or folk dances that we have here, or you have social dances from Western Africa or India or whatever. There's sort of like a fun element of this as well. Community pride and education. And I like those things being paired. I never thought about it like this, but this idea of education stemming from the pride of your culture. Like, I'm not passing this down because I need to teach you and you have to get to some level. It's like, no, this is important. My father taught it to me, my auntie taught it to me. And that education element, this like idea of music schools started as a way to continue to like strengthen the bonds of one particular culture. Again, regional. And then of course, emotional expression and aesthetic enjoyment. My argument here today is that we've over-indexed on the fifth one. It's a great one, but it's like, that's kind of like one of the main functions of music in 2025. If you go to church, you'll see the second one. But if you don't go to church, which more and more of us don't go, or I was Buddhist by birth. I had hippie parents. I didn't go to Biggie Hart's drum workshop necessarily, but and so I currently belong to a meditation center in town. There's no music, but we sit and meditate, and I love them very dearly. But there's not like a musical element. And I've gone to churches where they just sort of play music on the iPad. There's that going on too. It's like we've lost a little bit of that. Not all churches. I think there's a bunch of. So we don't have to dig in too much into all these, but here's some ancient musicians of the book that I just thought were really interesting. The EP comes from 2600 BCE, one of the first recorded evidence of musicians. He was a flautist, master of ceremonies, and a priest for King Sneferu. And there's all these paintings and statues that talk about him playing flute in these kind of small ensembles for death, entombment, resurrection, fertility. Played some wild stuff. He was a musician, important musician, but also a priest, and those words were almost like the same thing in ancient Egypt. Pindar was a Greek poet and composer, 520 BCE, and he made his money writing odes to champion athletes during like early proto-Olympics, and just like valor, courage, and all that kind of stuff, and was a very successful musician. Pronomus was another interesting person who was this charismatic touring performer, and he grew up playing the aulos, which is this like double reed instrument that has like two, like imagine two oboes or two clarinets, and you blow through it and the reed is actually lower in, and it just like, you have to blow so hard that it vibrates the reed in. And then it's like one's kind of a drone and one's sort of a melody. Bagpipes, like a play school life force bagpipes kind of thing. But a very important instrument in ancient Greece. And he was one of the first like rock stars. There's always these writings of people that saw him playing. He would have all these facial gestures. He would run around the stage. He was really athletic, and everyone just loved him. He toured the world. And what's interesting about that, I didn't write it down because I don't know my geography that well, is he talked about regional pride and resource, utilizing resources. He comes from Lake Copias in, I can't remember, right? Boectia? I'm sorry, I have to look it up. But there's this particular lake where the reeds grew the best. And he's from that village, and he comes from a long line of very famous, successful altos players. So he happened to, the same way that Stevie Wonder was born in Detroit. Do we know who Stevie Wonder is? If he was born in Memphis? Maybe not. Upstate New York? Maybe not. He happened to be born in the cradle of the most advanced, technologically advanced music recording studio in the world. That's a reason why we know Aretha Franklin grew up in a church that encouraged her to sing. Do we know of her? That church, like how many geniuses, we talk of genius as if it's one singular person. No, man, it's a result of a community. And that's why I really dig that idea of like that community had a genius for reed playing for these altos players. Amir, what can I pronounce his name? Khusrau. Amir Khusrau. Indian musician, but he had a Turkic father who was actually born a slave, but his Indian mother was royalty. And he brought Persian elements, and it was, at the time, that was not seen as a proper way to be, half Turkic, half Persian, bringing in that into India. And yet he was such an incredible musician, partly because he brought some of these, foreign ideas and concepts and poetry from Persia, which has this very long history of poetry like Rumi, and music that's a little bit more Sufism and a little bit more mystical. He brought some of that to the proper Indian music, and he's considered the father of Qawwali music, which is a particular kind of Pakistani music. Has anyone ever heard of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan? Doesn't matter. He's very famous, kind of a crossover Pakistani musician that sings praises to Hinduism. It's a Hindu kind of music. And he started doing that well before it became this entrenched musical concept. And he's also considered to be one of the forefathers of Hindustani classical music, which gives you Ravi Shankar, Zakir Hussain, and all these very famous modern Indian musicians. And people think that he invented the sitar. There was a 3-string instrument at the time that was very popular. And he added in 15 strings. The sitar had a lot of strings. And this idea of sympathetically vibrating strings. So a sitar has 2 layers of strings. You play one layer and it vibrates the other layer as if you were like playing with the piano with the sustain pedal on. That's sort of how a sitar worked. Well, he invented all that by bringing his own regional genius, the genius of his forefathers from Persia, and just bringing that into music. I mentioned Akash no Kakouchi, Japanese composer of this epic that consists of roughly 182 cantatas, each one lasting about 30 to 40 minutes. And it's about the 12th century Genpai War, which is a very important kind of like altering event in Japan. I don't know a ton about it. Is any Genpai folks here? But it's these 2 kind of warring factions that were trying to control Japan. And he wrote the tale of the Heike. The Heike was the losing tribe. And it became so popular that they think, like the people that have analyzed this, I haven't listened to the whole cantata, I'm not trying to be an expert on it, but that the seeds of that have led to modern storytelling and even traces of anime today, the way that anime stories are told, the way that Akira Kurosawa used to direct his movies, and Miyazaki, this kind of modern Japanese storytelling that's so popular. A lot of that traces back to this composer. I'm running out of time. I keep talking too much. So this Malinese composer, yeah, of course, yeah, no problem. Brought together the Mali Empire by writing songs and epics about like the victorious king. Bishop Ambrose was part of the Arian controversy versus the Mysians and the Arians about like Mysians.
Something like that, yeah.
Was Jesus born from Mary or not? I can't remember the whole detail, but it almost caused an entire war. And he was a bishop in Milan, and the Pope wanted to actually take him to prison and stop him because he was writing all these like really interesting songs that he learned from Eastern Europe and brought these like antiphonal, really cool choir pieces that just got everyone all jazzed up. And during one particular siege, he just kept his congregation for days singing his songs until finally the advancing army was just like, never mind. And it was like that powerful. This is like a very intense guy. And Hedwana is one of the very first, recorded authors. And she was a priestess, and she wrote all this music in Sumer, and she combined the cults of Sumer and Akkad, kind of brings, because her dad was the king, so she was kind of bringing that region together with these songs. Jamila was a really interesting former slave turned vocalist who would put together these, all I know how to say is like soirees, where there'd be poetry and dancing and music, and it was very like sexually charged, but then people would just lose their mind when she would sing. And then she started all these music schools for former slaves because she started this whole cottage industry. And so she was given, you know, at the time, there was a lot of slavery, but she did something that one might even construe as giving humanity to people who were enslaved. So I'll kind of skip through all this stuff, but there's clearly a dissatisfaction with modern living, right? There's, the Harris poll talks about that even within the youth, 47% of the youth wish that TikTok was never invented. That's really fascinating. There's a dissatisfaction with technology. 80% of Gen Z believe young people are too dependent. Technologies are driving us apart. They worry about the effect that mental health has on today's young people. Only 44% of Americans say they're very satisfied with the things that are going in their personal life. It's not a political thing, it's just their own personal life. That's about the lowest ever measured by the Gallup poll. Religion, the fastest growing religion is people that have left religions, right? And then just community in general, like this idea of, do you feel close to people in your local community? The total is 54%, and as you can see, 65 and up, and it just goes down precipitously. Like we're just not feeling connected. And then this one is specifically a Harvard Youth Poll, so 18 to 29, I believe, or maybe even younger, it doesn't matter. But this idea of like, what best describes your sense of belonging to a community? I feel somewhat connected to community, tops out with women at 30%. It's just like a total failure of modern living. And again, I go back to my weird recording industry graph. It's like this is a very modern phenomenon. And plague, if you will. It's a plague of connection. We just don't have it in the way that we are been bred to do so. To quote Ursula K. Le Guin again, like we weren't born for this world, yet we have to teach our children how to live. So nothing happens in a straight line. Nothing is extrapolated forever and ever. Things go in curves or pulse waves, if you will, frequencies. And so I really am hopeful, despite all the sad facts. On sad facts. You're welcome to boo at any point. But I think if you just extrapolate these concepts that I borrowed from an earlier slide, these kind of functions of music that Lewis Holmes talks about in history, you can imagine how those would be extrapolated today. So this idea of storytelling and history keeping coming back in a modern way, spirituality, rituals, trance, social fun, entrainment, community pride and education, emotional expression, and aesthetic enjoyment. As I was putting this together, I was thinking of specific examples in Pocatello and stuff, like storytelling and history keeping. You know, there's a local, like Zach Hearn does such a great job in history. He did a great lecture a few years ago on the Baha'i faith that a lot of people came and he brought music to There's podcasts being done, the work that you're doing at KISU with like local history, spirituality, rituals, and trance. Like I would even put music therapy into this. And you know, as you know from my piece, like I'm very interested in music therapy, and the head neonatologist at Portland Medical Center, Dr. O'Donnell, who was my son's doctor when he was in the NICU, is an advocate, supporter of music therapy and in new technologies. There's this whole concept called environmental music therapy, where you actually take the sounds of the hospital room and you take them into consideration with music therapy, which is something I also experienced with my son. Social fun and entrainment, contra dancing is like one of the biggest hits of the town, man. There's so much contra dancing going on. Community pride and education. I just looked to Snake River Strings Studio, which now has 4, former student of mine actually, Shelby and Ray Murdoch, has 4 locations: Blackfoot, Idaho Falls, Rexburg, and Pocatello, of community music learning. My daughter learns fiddle there with Maggie, and my son just started drum lessons with Nathan. And these are like great things. And then I'll shout out Shady Grove as well as like an example of a local festival. Emotional expression, aesthetic enjoyment. Of course, there's all kinds of things that would fall under that. And then the last thing I'll say is, as you can see, electronic music and video games are a huge part of all these. I really think that's a giant part of what the future can entail. So instead of shirking technologies, despite what I talked about today, I'm no Luddite, like a lot of this stuff can be done through electronic music, through video games, that you can actually use these things, which are now the currency of the youth, young people. What is the quote? If you want to know what the future is like, pay attention to what the 15-year-olds are doing. They're playing video games. And they're online, hanging out with each other. They're watching esports. They don't really care who wins the Mariners game today, but they do care like who wins Valorant. Do you know what I'm saying? There is a new world coming, but I think it can actually bend back towards this sense of community, because I think people miss it. That's my life. Sorry, I went a little long.
No, it's fascinating. Just a lot of food for thought there, and
Yeah. Any questions or pushbacks? Complaints?
There's a very extensive world of music that I know nothing about. All these other ones that you just told us about that sound really interesting, but never in any of my music courses did I ever learn anything about Western music.
I agree, and I've done as much as I can in the time that I've been here, even more so recently, to change that. But it's still an issue. It's still an issue.
Well, there's plenty to learn in Western music.
That's the thing.
That's the problem.
Well, you can do that. Yeah, you can do that forever, right? But you're right. You have to get to your secondary young. But even like ethically, like running a program where I'm asking students to invest money in tuition, even if it is fairly inexpensive. Like ethically, I mean, like you have to know if you're going to be a musician in the 2030s. It stands a chance. Like I don't know what the industry looks like then, but understanding world music traditions. Because the second you start learning a few different world music traditions, like the sense of time, the sense of melody, the phrasing just like scrambles your brain in a good way. I think it's really important.
so I'm the music bibliographer at the library, Alice Badger, and just throwing that out there. And as part of, like, as I'm trying to buy books and build up the music, I have tried to expand beyond Western music, the Western canon, and looking for non-Western.
I gotta come like a suggestion.
You can totally email me, and seriously, I'm so open to recommendations, and because my own personal interests, you know, like Yo-Yo Ma and his whole like Silk Road project, and trying to recreate like all of that and bringing all these different musicians together, like that has always really spoken to me and moved me kind of beyond Western canon.
That's why he's one of the great musicians of our time. Is not only can he play Bach so beautifully, but he hangs out with the best old-time bluegrass players.
Yeah.
Go rodeo. Then he puts together. Do you guys know the Silk Road Ensemble? The 12 to 15 piece world music. There's like a Chinese master, an Iranian Persian master.
Yeah, Indian.
And it's like they're all on stage together. They arrange arrange music and he's right there with the cello. Like he continues as a master musician to put himself in a situation where he is not the master. And that's the
And he's worked with
highest-
Alison Krauss too.
Yeah, he works with Alison Krauss.
Yeah, and
He's
it's,
a serious musician. It's not like he just like, he's like, okay, I learned my thing. He's just beautiful. And then of course, he'll like, during COVID, he would go to like the Food Line and just play for free in New York. I mean, he's a really beautiful soul. Yeah, great example.
Yeah.
But I will email you, there's a wonderful like beginning Indian sargam book that I teach my students
Okay.
out of. That would be really great.
I would, thank you, yeah.
There's some really great like Indian rhythm stuff. There's some great like other world music books. These two books I'm a huge fan of.
I have written both of those down, so if the library does not have them, I'm going to add them.
Yeah, they're just really, but I will definitely send this
Yeah.
stuff from my personal library.
Yeah, that would be awesome, because that is something that, I'm also the theater and dance bibliographer, and so they're both kind of interconnected there, and so that is something that, as I buy books, or I'm trying to buy music or plays, looking to expand beyond.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
Can I just write you know that right now?
Yeah, it's Allison Badger, ALLISONBADGER.
B-A.
Yeah,
Cool.
like the animal, and,
I'll get you.
Are you from Wisconsin?
no, but I am a Wisconsin fan. Which got me into trouble when I lived in Nebraska. Yeah, I know. In Nebraska, not being a Cornhusker fan was a big deal, and
Yes.
A couple of things that have stuck in my mind. The talking drum, and the guy didn't understand it. Was your friend just tapping out gobbledygook, or was he telling some story of somebody in his teacher's village, or?
His best guess is the latter, that his teacher was like, well, I'm just gonna teach you this rhythm. And my friend is a very good drummer, so I'm sure he played it the way he heard it. But that his teacher never was like, well, actually, here's the words you're trying to say.
It means this.
Yeah, so he learned what he thought, which,
yeah.
you know, when I'm like transcribing jazz songs by Leslie Young, jazz songs that he recorded in Kansas City, it's like I can do my best, but me then teaching that, it's like at some point you lose the thread. And the point of the story isn't to say my friend appropriated or that it was the wrong thing. My friend could still write music that was inspired by it. Certainly, you know, with my piece, there's a lot of inspirations. I just wrote a concerto that I played this, and there's a lot of world music influences in that. But it's not me trying to be like, now we're going to do an Indian thing. It's like, well, this concept from Indian music, there's ways that you can still do stuff. But that's what I think happened.
But it's your exposure to that music that helps you put it into yours.
Totally.
And without that exposure, what you would write would be very different.
You're 100% right. Yeah. So it's that mix of like, did you luck into?